Hi guys, back to chapter 7, section 3 here. We're going to move from India into China and talk about the Han dynasty. Um, so let's talk about a few of the things that we're going to have here. Just not many terms in this one. The Han dynasty is the main dynasty of the entire section. We'll talk a little bit more about how their government was more centralized and concentrated. The importance of the civil service program that was developed that's long been a part of Chinese culture, the concept of a monopoly when it comes to the economy, and also the importance of assimilation within Chinese culture. And so let's just start this way. Under the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, the Qin dynasty had unified China, and Shi Huangdi had established a strong central government by conquering the rival kings in the region who ruled, smaller states throughout China. And after you have somebody that's really strong that dies, as usually happens in history, things kind of fall apart. And so after Shirhanji died in the year 210 BC, his son was weak and ineffective, and China's government kind of fell apart. So let's go ahead and take that into where we're going. So geography-wise, here's a map that you can refer to as for references and the other PowerPoint file within the Schoology. Okay, so here we go. And so rumblings of discontent during the Qin dynasty would eventually grow deafening in the years after Shirhanji's death. If you remember the Chinese mandate of heaven, when people lose favor and things start to fall apart, the people look for places to lay the blame. And so peasants were very bitter over years of high taxes and really harsh labor quotas, and even like a severe penal system of prisons. So they rebelled, and rival kings were eager to regain control of the regions that they once had prior to Qin Shi Huangdi. And so they raised armies and they began to fight over territories. During that civil war that followed this, two powerful leaders would emerge. There is Xiang Yu, who was an aristocratic general who was willing to allow the warlords to keep their territories if they would just acknowledge him as their overall ruler. And then there was Liu Bang, and he was one of Xiang Yu's generals. And eventually, Liu Bang turned against Xiang Yu, and the two fought their final battle in the year 202 BC. And Liu Bang won and declared himself the first emperor of the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty, which ruled China for more than 400 years, is divided into two periods. The former Han ruled for about 2 centuries until the year 9 AD. And then after a brief period where the Han were out of power, the later Han ruled for almost another 200 years. The Han dynasty so influenced China that even today many Chinese call themselves the people of the Han, and so they consider themselves part of that Han dynasty. So Liu Bang's first goal was to destroy all the rivals and their power, and so he would follow Shirhanji's policy of establishing a centralized government, and that's in which all the central authority controls the running of the country. And reporting to Liu Bang's central government were hundreds of local provincial authorities called commanderies. And to win popular support, Liu Bang departed from Qin Shi Huangdi's strict adherence to a process called legalism, where the law was the most important thing. He did lower taxes, and he kind of reduced some of the more harsher punishments. And so people throughout the empire appreciated the peace and stability that Liu Bang made for the Chinese people. When Liu Bang died in 195 BC, his son became the emperor, and but really only in name only. The real ruler was his mother. Her name was the Empress Lu, Lu. And although Lu had not been Liu Bang's only wife, she was she had very powerful friends in the royal court, and they helped her seize the power. Empress Lu outlived her son and maintained control of the throne by naming first an infant and then another baby and emperor as emperor. Because the infants were too young to rule, she maintained control as a regent. And when Empress Lu died in the year 180 BC, people who remained loyal to Lu Bang's family, rather than to the Empress Lu's family, they then came back into power. And then they proceeded to clean up the palace of all the old Empress's supporters and relatives by putting them to death. Empress Lu was ruthless in her pursuit of power and made many enemies in Chinese government. However, though, to gain support once in power, she did adopt moderate governing, such as lowering taxes and repealing some unpopular laws. Um, there were palace plots, though, that existed within the Chinese system, and they occurred all throughout the Han Dynasty. Traditionally, the emperor chose the favorite among his wives as the empress and appointed one of his sons to be his successor. But because of this, the palace women and their families competed fiercely for the emperor's notice, and the families would make alliances with influential people all throughout the Chinese system. And the resulting power plays distracted the emperor and his officials so much that they sometimes they couldn't govern effectively. And so when Lu Bang's great grandson took the throne, he continued Lu Bang's centralizing policies, and his name was Wu Di, W-D-I. And Wu Di reigned from 141 to 87 BC, and he held the throne longer than any other Han emperor. He is also called the Martial Emperor because he adopted the policy of expanding the Chinese empire through war. And Wu Di's first set of enemies were a group of people called the Xiongnu, and they were fierce nomads known for the ability to shoot from horseback as archers. And the Xiongnu roamed the steppes and the open areas to the north and west of China, and they made raids into China, and they settled in farmland on China's frontier. They often took hostages and stole grain, livestock, and other valuable things. And the early Han emperors tried to buy off the Xiongnu by sending them thousands of pounds of silk and rice and alcohol and money. But usually the Xiongnu just accepted these gifts, and they would continue their different raids. When Wu Di realized that the bribes were simply just making the Xiongnu stronger, he sent more than 100,000 soldiers to fight them. And to help defeat the Xiongnu, Wu Di also made allies of their enemies. And after his army forced the Xiongnu to retreat into Central Asia, Wu Di attempted to make his northwest border safe by settling troops on the Xiongnu's former pastures. And although this tactic succeeded for a time, nomadic raiders continued to cause problems during much of China's later history. And Wu Di also colonized areas to the northeast in what is now Manchuria, and then he made his way into Korea. He also sent armies south where they conquered different mountain tribes and set up Chinese colonies all the way into what is now modern-day Vietnam. And by the end of Wu Di's reign, the empire had expanded nearly to the bounds of what is now present-day China. Chinese society under the Han Dynasty was structured rather rigidly. And just as Han emperors had tried to control the people they conquered, they exerted vast control over the Chinese themselves. And because the Chinese believed their emperor to have divine authority through the mandate of heaven, they accepted his exercise of power. And he was the link between heaven and earth. If the emperor did his job well, China had peace and prosperity. If he failed, the heavens showed their displeasure with earthquakes and floods and famines. And the problem was, the emperor didn't rule by himself. The Chinese emperor relied on a complex bureaucracy to help him rule. If you remember first semester, I used to compare the bureaucracy to the DMV when you go get your driver's license. Running the bureaucracy and maintaining the imperial army were very expensive. And to raise money, the government would levy or create taxes. And like the farmers in India, Chinese peasants owed part of their yearly crops to the government, and merchants also paid taxes. And besides taxes, the peasants also owed the government a month's worth of labor or military service every year. And with this source of labor, the Han emperors built roads and dug canals and irrigation ditches. The emperors also filled the ranks of China's vast armies and expanded the Great Wall of China, which stretched across its northern border. You have to ignore Maggie there; she's a little restless. Um, Wu Di's government also employed more than 130,000 people, and so this bureaucracy included different ranks of civil service jobs, which were government jobs that civilians could get by taking different examinations and tests. At times, and Chinese emperors rewarded loyal followers with these special government jobs. Um, However, another way to fill up government posts evolved under the Han. This method involved testing applicants' knowledge of Confucianism. These are the teachings of the teacher Confucius, who had lived about 400 years before. And sometimes Confucianism is often classed as a religion, but Confucianism does not include a belief in a god, or it doesn't have a clergy of any kind. Rather, it's more of a set of like humanistic moral teachings that have been the guiding principle of Chinese life from the 5th century BC all the way up into modern times. And so Confucius holds an important role within the Chinese system. The early Han emperors had employed some Confucian scholars as court advisors, but it was Wu Di who began to actively favor them. And Confucius had taught that gentlemen should practice reverence and respect, which is respect, generosity, truthfulness, diligence, and kindness. Because these were exactly the qualities he wanted for his government officials to have, Wu Di set up a special school where hopeful job applicants from all over China could come to study Confucius's works. After their studies, job applicants took formal examinations in history, law, literature, and Confucianism. And in theory, anyone could take the exams, but in practice, few peasants could afford to take their children and educate their sons. So only sons of wealthy landowners had a chance at a government career. In spite of that flaw, the civil service system begun by Wu Di worked so efficiently that it continued in China until the year 1912, when we have the last dynasty of the Chinese. Oh, well, we have that there. We've already talked about it. Okay, here we go. So the 400 years of Han rule saw not only improvements in education, but also great advances in Chinese technology and culture. So in addition, the centralized government began to exert more control over commerce and manufacture. If you hear that squeaking in the background, that's Tanner. I think he's killing a duck. But anyway, advances in technology influenced all aspects of Chinese life. Paper was invented in 105 AD, and before that, books were usually written on silk. But paper was cheaper, so books became readily available. And this helped spread education in China, and the invention of paper also affected Chinese government. So formerly, all government documents had been recorded on strips of wood, but paper was much more convenient to use for record keeping, so the Chinese bureaucracy expanded. Another technological advance was the collar harness for horses. And this invention allowed horses to pull much heavier loads than did the harness being used in Europe at the time. And the Chinese also perfected a plow, and you can kind of see it here, that was more efficient because it had two blades. They also improved iron tools, invented the wheelbarrow, and began to use water mills to grind grain. Let's see if I can get this next slide or not. Not quite yet. During the Han Dynasty, the population of China swelled to about 60 million people. And because there were so many people to feed, Confucian scholars and ordinary Chinese people considered agriculture to be the most important and honored occupation. Although, they claimed that it was the most important occupation, they would say, like trading and merchants was the least important, but really farmers were kind of set to the side. They were told they were great, but they weren't really treated great. The government, though, eventually established something called monopolies. What are we doing there? There we go. And those monopolies were placed on the mining of salt, the creation of iron, the minting of coins, and the brewing of alcohol. And so a monopoly will occur when a group has exclusive control over the production and the distribution of certain goods. So for a time, the government also ran huge silk mills, competing with private silk weavers in making of that cloth. And as contact with people from other lands increased, the Chinese realized how valuable their silk was for an item of trade. And because of this, the technique for silk production became a closely guarded state secret. And so eventually, spurred by the demand for worldwide demand for silk, Chinese commerce expanded along the Silk Roads to most of Asia, through India, all the way to Rome. According to legend, the secret of raising silkworms and obtaining silk from the cocoons was discovered by an empress in China in the year 2640 BC. And the Chinese domesticated the silkworm, and the silkworm's main food source, the mulberry tree. And the science of silkworm production is called sericulture, Sericulture, and involves killing the silkworm and unwinding the cocoon in a continuous thread more than 2,000 feet long. The process was kept secret in China for thousands of years. What's wrong, Cooper? Just hold on. All right, Cooper's getting anxious. He snuck in here. Yes. Let me open the door for him real quick. Go on. There you go. I don't even know how he got in here. Okay, so as the Han Empire expanded its trade networks, the Chinese began to learn about the foods and fashions common in foreign places. And so expanding the empire through conquest brought people of different cultures to China, Chinese rule as well. And so to unify the empire, the Chinese government encouraged something called assimilation. And so assimilation is the process of making conquered peoples part of the Chinese culture. And so to promote assimilation, the government sent Chinese farmers to settle in newly colonized areas. It also encouraged them to intermarry with local people. And government officials set up schools to train local people in the Confucian philosophy, and then appointed local scholars to those government posts. Several writers also helped to unify Chinese culture by recording Chinese history. There's a historian, his name is Sima Qian, and he lived from 145 to 85 BC. He's called the Great Historian or Grand Historian for his work in compiling a history of China from the ancient dynasties to Wu Di. Sima Qian grew up in the court of the emperor, where his father was the Grand Historian as well. And this title is sometimes translated as Astronomer Royal, since the post also involved making astronomical observations and reforming the calendar. He took over the post when his father died in 107 BC, and Sima Qian was devoted to presenting the truth and incorporated many of the historical records word for word. He began composing Records of the Grand Historian in 104 BC and didn't complete it for 13 years. This monumental book includes 130 chapters that trace the development of China to his own time. So to write accurately, Sima Qian would visit historical sites, and he would interview eyewitnesses, and he researched official records and examined artifact. And his book, The Records of the Grand Historian, it's invaluable. Another famous book was The History of the Former Han Dynasty, and this was written by Ban Biao, and he lived from the year 3 AD to 54 AD, and he started the project. But after his death, his son, Bonggu, and his later daughter, Banzhou, worked on it as well. And Banzhou also wrote a guide called Lessons for Women, which called upon women to be humble and obedient, but also industrious. Although Banzhou gained fame as a historian, most women during the Han Dynasty led quiet lives at home. Confucian teachings had dictated that women were to devote themselves to their families. However, women made important contributions to their family economic life through duties in the home and work in the fields on the family farm. Some upper-class women lived much different lives. A few empresses wielded great power. Taoist and later Buddhist nuns were able to gain an education and lead lives apart from their families. And women in aristocratic and landowning families sometimes pursued education and culture. Some women were able to run small shops, and others were able to practice medicine. But in spite of the cultural and economic advances, the Han emperors faced grave problems. One of the main problems was an economic imbalance caused by customs that allowed the rich to gain more wealth at the expense of the poor. According to custom, a family's land was divided equally among all the father's male heirs. And unless a farmer could afford to buy more land during his lifetime, each generation inherited smaller plots of land. With such small plots of land, farmers had a hard time raising enough food to sell or even to feed their family. Because of this, small farmers often went into debt and had to borrow money from huge landholders. And they would charge very high interest rates. If the farmer couldn't pay back the debt, the landowner took possession of the farmer's land. Large landowners were not required to pay taxes. And so when their land holdings increased, the amount of land that was left for the government to tax decreased. With less money coming in, the government pressed harder to collect money from the small farmers, and as a result, the gap between the rich and the poor began to grow. It just increased. So during the time of economic change, then political instability continues to grow. And at the palace, the court advisors, the palace servants, and different rival influential families wove complex plots to influence the emperor's choice of who would succeed him as a ruler. And from about 32 BC until about the year 9 AD, one inexperienced emperor would replace the other. And chaos just kind of ruled in the palace, and peasants would revolt, and unrest would spread across the land as well. So finally, a man named Wang Mang, a Confucian scholar and member of the court, decided that a strong ruler was needed to restore order. So for 6 years, he had been acting as a regent for the infant who had been crowned emperor. And in the year 9 AD, Wang Mang took the imperial title for himself and overthrew the Han. And this ended the former Han dynasty, and which is the first half of the Han. Wang Mang tried to bring the country under control. He meant to do money to relieve the treasury shortage and set up public granaries to help feed China's poor. Wang Mang also took away large landholdings from the rich and planned to redistribute the land to the farmers who had lost their land, the smaller farmers. But this plan angered powerful landholders, of course, and Wang Mang's larger supply of money disrupted the economy because it allowed people to increase their spending, which encouraged merchants to raise prices. We all know this as inflation. And although Wang Mang overthrew the Han dynasty, he did believe strongly in the law, and this belief was even stronger than his family ties. And he executed 3 of his sons, 1 grandson, and 1 nephew for breaking laws that had been in power. In the year 11 AD, a great flood left thousands of people dead, millions of people homeless, and the public granaries did not hold enough grain to feed all the displaced and starving people. And so huge peasant revolts began to rock the land, and the wealthy, opposed to Wang Mang's land policies, joined in the rebellion. He should remind you a little bit of the Gracchi brothers from when we talked about the Greeks. The rebels eventually assassinated Wang Mang in the year 23 AD, and within 2 years, a member of the old imperial family took the throne and began the second period of Han rule that is called the Later Han. So we have peace restored in China during the first decades of the Later Han dynasty, and it was a quite prosperous time. The government sent soldiers and merchants westward to regain control of different posts along the Silk Roads, but this expansion could not make up for the different social, political, and economic weaknesses within Han China. And so within a century, China suffered from the same economic imbalances and political intrigue and social unrest that had overthrown the first half of the Han, the former Han. And by the year 220 AD, the later Han dynasty had disintegrated into 3 rival kingdoms. And you can see here underneath the picture, this brings us into a period that's known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion. All right, so that's the end of Chapter 7, Section 3. There's an assignment that accompanies this as well. It's also the end of Chapter 7. All right. Thanks, guys. Sorry the dogs were a bother there, but I'll talk to you later.